Hello everybody, welcome to Drydock episode 104. Today's questions are taken from the guide to USS Langley, that is guide number 172, and the first part of the little mini-series on naval artillery, covering the period of 1400 to 1650. Arkan asks, how viable would a 10-inch main gun heavy cruiser with a 9-inch belt be during World War II? I'm picturing something along the lines of 8 10-inch guns in twin turrets superfiring fore and aft, with dual-purpose US 5-inch guns as secondaries and AA defence, as well as 40mm Bofors. So there's two aspects to what you've got there. A cruiser with a 9-inch belt is probably actually relatively useful during World War II. I mean, you're talking about something with the kind of protection that the battle cruisers Renown and Repulse have. That's going to provide a fairly decent protection at pretty much any reasonable range against 6-inch and 8-inch gunfire, so if you're positioning this as a heavy cruiser, then great, you've just ensured that you actually have meaningful protection against incoming enemy shell fire at the weight class you're aiming to fight, which, to be perfectly fair, a lot of heavy cruisers didn't actually have. They had the firepower, certainly, but their ability to resist incoming 8-inch shells was, shall we say, often lacking. However, the 10-inch gun is not really a happy weapon. The reason for this is that when you look at the weight of the gun, the weight of the average 10-inch gun is about double what the weight of the average 8-inch gun is. But the weight of something like a 12-inch gun, which is at the absolute lower end of capital ship grade weaponry, is 50% more than a 10-inch gun. So the jump from 10 to 12 is a lot smaller than the jump from 8 to 10. And just for reference, you're looking at around 15 to 20 tons for an 8-inch gun, 35 to 40 tons for a 10-inch gun, and then starting at around 55 to 60 tons for a 12-inch gun. So if you've got a triple 8-inch mount, for example, you could exchange, at least disregarding turrets and such like, but just pure gun weight, you could exchange that for a single 12-inch weapon, or you could exchange it for a single 10-inch weapon, because you still don't have the displacement to spare. You need to factor in another 20 or so tons before you can factor in two 10-inch guns. Additionally to that is the fact that the 10-inch gun has a rate of fire that more closely approaches the 12-inch weapon. I mean, basically it's quite slow, but its penetration and explosive power are nowhere near that of the 12-inch. They're actually a lot closer to the 8-inch. So effectively, you're sacrificing rate of fire for a very minimal increase in killing power. But what it comes down to ultimately is that weight issue with the gun, because, well, if you're going to stick a 9-inch belt on something, you're going to have a heavy cruiser that's either going to be armed with a 4-inch pop gun, or it's going to be well in excess of the 10,000-ton weight limit. But assuming that you're willing to blow past that, the weight of your ship will increase somewhat substantially for a 9-inch belt, but if you're going to have the necessary weight and dimension increases to fit both that and a 10-inch main armament, your displacement's going to skyrocket, and you're going to end up with something that's probably within shouting distance of the displacement of some of the older retained capital ships of the larger navies, but it's not going to be capable of taking them on in the slightest, because 9-inch belt armour, it kind of works on battle cruisers, but what you've created here is something that's got the armour of a battle cruiser, but the armament of a heavy cruiser with ambitions, so it can't even hit back as hard as something like Renown or Repulse could. And all of that means expense and time to build, which means you're not going to have very many of them, which in turn means that they're going to be targeted by the enemy's capital ships, because they effectively are small capital ships. And that's not going to end well. I mean, in some ways, you're kind of going with the concept that backs up the Deutschland-class Panzerschiff, although obviously there's no particular comment on speed here. But I think they're probably going to share the similar kind of fate, in that, yes, you've created something that a single heavy cruiser or a couple of light cruisers can't beat, and with its greater protection, probably It's going to be a lot harder for any combination of heavy cruisers to do or light cruisers to do anything other than overwhelm it with fire and smash up everything atop. But equally, it's probably going to end up just being hunted down by enemy large vessels. Whereas if you're building it for something like, say, the US Navy, where that's not so much of a risk, you're going to end up using up so much displacement once you've taken into account torpedo defense, the necessary machinery for speed and such, like, that you might as well add a few hundred, maybe a couple of thousand tons more and go with something like the Alaskas, because your operating costs are going to be about the same, but the Alaskas can actually punch back against a fair number of capital ships, whereas this theoretical vessel with the 10-inch guns can't. Andrea Marioni asks, is it true that Bismarck and Tirpitz were originally intended to be armed with 13-inch guns, and the Germans decided to go for 15-inch guns when they discovered that Richelieu and Littorio were going to be armed with 15-inch weapons? So the answer is sort of, inasmuch as the design studies that eventually would result in the final version of Bismarck were initially designed with smaller calibre guns. The actual finalised Bismarck design always had 15-inch guns. So the background to that is effectively that back when the German Navy was thinking about potentially getting back into the battleship building game, they thought they're going to have to abide by the 35,000-ton limit of the Washington Naval Treaty. And so you have this balance of speed, protection, and firepower that you can see in the original North Carolina designs, the King George V design, etc. And the German designs at the time wanted a lot of armour. They also wanted a lot of speed. They wanted 30 knots, and that actually requires quite a lot more machinery than 28 knots does, which is what North Carolina's in theory and the King George V's in practice kind of settled on. So, given that they needed a lot more space and displacement within that 35,000-ton limit for machinery, and they were going on the heavier side of armour protection, that meant that weaponry had to be downscaled a bit. So yeah, initially the design studies were looking at 13-inch guns. Then they thought that Italy and France were going to go with 14-inch weapons, because that kind of looked to be the calibre under which the treaties were going to be going. And so they were arguing maybe we should have 14-inch guns as well. But then they decided that actually maybe we should go with 15-inch guns, because that would allow a numerically inferior German fleet to have slightly more firepower on a per-ship basis compared to everybody else. Now, of course, when you're arming your ships with pretty heavy weaponry, and you're going with relatively extensive amounts of armour, and you're going for high speed, this is one of the reasons, along with some design inefficiencies, as to why the Bismarck's displacement ballooned from the originally aimed for 35,000-ton treaty compliance design to the kind of 42+ thousand ton displacement, depending on exactly what time period you're looking at and whether you're looking at Bismarck or Tirpitz, because Tirpitz completed significantly heavier than her sister ship. Now, as I said, those were design studies. The final approved design that came up with the ship that we would know as Bismarck and of its sister ship, that at the stage that it was signed off for building was armed with 15-inch guns. So it wasn't like, say, the North Carolinas, where you had a design that used 14-inch weapons that was signed off and then was altered effectively mid-construction. The Bismarcks, as a signed-off design, always were armed with 15-inch weapons. But, yeah, as I said, their design studies had smaller caliber weaponry as well. Graham Baxter asks, what would you consider a reasonable range of operation for a ship of the early 16th century? I.e., how far or how long would you expect a naval ship such as a carrack or galleon to be able to travel before requiring resupply? Unfortunately, there's no real hard and fast answer for this kind of thing, because the factors involved are far too variable compared to modern day, where a ship is effectively limited by how far can its fuel take it. Now, the reason for that is, well, apart from anything else, carracks and galleons came in all sorts of weird and wonderful shapes and sizes. Secondly would be, how many crew have you got aboard? If you're sailing with a deliberate purpose to explore, take messages, or raid, for example, then you will probably be sailing with significantly fewer crew than if you're sailing for something like, say, the Armada, where you're expecting full-on fleet actions and heavy boarding. And I mean, also, the cultural elements of your particular navy are going to make a big difference as well. So if you're in the English navy of the period, you're going to have a lot fewer men aboard for boarding actions and such like, as you compared to a Spanish vessel where boarding is very much still in vogue. And the reason why the number of men aboard makes a difference is, of course, everyone needs feeding, everyone needs watering, and so the more men you have on board, the faster you're going to go through your supplies for a given size of ship. Then there's the issue of the supplies themselves. If you are going to be sailing to or from the tropics, so let's say you're a Venetian trader heading through the Mediterranean down into the Atlantic, and for some reason maybe you've got a dispensation from the Spanish, so you're heading off to the Caribbean, a lot of your time at sea is going to be spent in a fairly hot and humid environment, which is going to cause your supplies to spoil faster. And it's also, when it comes to liquid refreshment, going to cause you to go through that a lot quicker as well, for obvious reasons. Now, if you happen to be, say, a Scottish long-distance fishing ship, and you're sailing from somewhere in the north of Scotland for, let's say, in the spring period, and you're heading out across the northern Atlantic, maybe you're heading off to the Great Cod Banks just off of the coast of North America, well, your time at sea is, for equally obvious reasons, going to be spent with a lot of cold weather, a lot of possibly ice, freezing conditions and such, and whilst that's not very pleasant, it does tend to slow down the overall rate of decay of some of your supplies. And obviously when you're not sweating like a pig in the middle of the tropics, you're also not going to require quite as much liquid refreshment, so your supplies will therefore last longer. Of course, there is a horrible mid-tier where you can be neither particularly warm nor particularly cold, and therefore the humidity makes everything rot and grow mildew like anything else, but that's not a particularly ideal scenario there, to be perfectly frank. And then, of course, you have the weather, because you might be stocked up to the gunnels with plenty of food supplies, but if you happen to drift a little bit too far north and you get stuck in ice, even if you've got supplies for 2 years, you might not actually go more than a few dozen miles. Whereas if you're, say, going to the tropics, if you happen to catch a pretty good trade wind, you could be halfway across the Atlantic before you've opened your second barrel of salt pork. So the weather, and particularly the wind in relation to both its strength and its direction relative to your destination, is going to make a huge difference as well. A ship with decent supplies, reasonably favourable weather and a good wind can go thousands of miles before it needs resupply, assuming it's well stocked and it's not overburdened with men. Whereas contrary winds, as we said, even if you're not stuck in ice, you're not going to be going all that far. So, yeah, with the wind being a hugely variable factor, something that's completely outside of your control, there's no real average reasonable range of operation for a ship in the early 16th century. Basically, what you would tend to find is that, well, we've got this idea, we want to go this way, we're going to overstock on supplies as best we can, and we're going to make sure that wherever we can, we call into port or harbour to restock as best as possible, whether that be with fresh fruit, fresh vegetables, fresh meat, or, most importantly, fresh water. This is one of the reasons why places like the Azores were very popular at the time, because they were a good stopping point to resupply these kinds of critical supplies. BK Zhong asks, in a hypothetical battle between the Grand Fleet at Jutland and all the American standard battleships that were built, which side would win? Some of that's going to depend quite heavily on era, because a lot of the Grand Fleet battleships are not quite contemporary with a lot of the standard class. When I say that, what I mean is things like the refitted Colorado class in World War II, for example, their capabilities are massively beyond the capabilities that they had when they were built. So if we want to go for the closest point at which all the standards are actually in service, it still requires some of the Grand Fleet ships to have their lives extended by a couple of years, but still, if we looked at the early 1920s, and we say that the standards start with the Nevada class, which is pretty much what everyone agrees on. It's an interesting one because, in general, the American ships have the advantage of firepower. Now, granted, there are the Queen Elizabeths and a couple of Resolution class Jutland, so it's not entirely one-sided in that respect. You do have 6 15-inch armed ships, I believe. And so, timeline-wise, early 1920s, well, compared to their 1916 iteration, the Grand Fleet does have the advantage of actually having working shells, and also having some of the more questionable ammunition handling practices resolved. So, yeah, I mean, the Colorados are hands down going to be the most powerful units present, because of, well, 16-inch gunfire. However, at the same time, some of the 14-inch armed US vessels are going to have severe problems with accuracy, and not just because they're US ships at this period, probably having forgotten the 6th Battle Squadron gunnery training, it's also because there were legitimate issues with the placement and interference of the various 14-inch guns in the triple turrets in certain classes of the standard class, which took a while to get resolved and weren't resolved by this early 1920s period entirely. However, that with all that said and done, the simple fact is speed and numbers. The standard class are limited to 21 knots. Fair enough, most of the Grand Fleet is, but the heaviest elements of the Grand Fleet are not. The R's can make 23 knots, the Queen Elizabeth can make 24-ish. So there's a slight speed advantage for the fastest and heaviest wing in the Grand Fleet, and we're assuming that we're not including the battle cruisers at this point, because at the end of the day, then it's more the numbers than anything else. There are 12 standards, as we said. There are 28 of the Grand Fleet, and as well as the 6 with the 15-inch guns, you've got Erin and Canada, you've got the 3 King George V's, you've got the 4 Orions, and you've got the 4 Iron Dukes, armed with a variety of 13.5 and 14-inch weapons, which firepower-wise are not too far behind the 14-inch guns that are obviously on most of the standards. The 12-inch ships obviously are at a disadvantage, but again, there's so many of them. It just comes down to, well, when you're outnumbered more than 2 to 1, and an element of the enemy has a speed advantage over you, yeah, the one-on-one, most of the American standard class will probably get the better of any given Grand Fleet vessel if you just pick them at random, because the chances are more likely you're going to pick a 13.5-inch ship or a 12-inch ship, albeit, as I said, the 13.5s aren't too far off the earlier standards. But for every ship that you engage, there's going to be 1 or 2 that are shooting at you with complete impunity. And we saw, actually, ironically enough, at Jutland, exactly what happens to ships when you ignore a target and it gets to shoot at you for free. So, yeah, based on pure numbers, I would have to hand the early 1920s upgraded Grand Fleet a victory over the early 1920s standard battle line. Econ Oclast asks, how did old-style rotating turrets and more modern hooded barbettes really differ? So there are actually a couple of important ways. One of them is the fact that a hooded barbette, or fully armoured barbette, either what we would consider to be a gun turret these days, like something you'd find on a Dreadnought battleship, it can have all sorts of weird and wonderful shapes, and it can have varying thicknesses of armour. So you can have a lot of armour on the front of such a quote-unquote turret, slightly less armour on the sides, slightly less armour still on the back, and if you've got multiple sides beyond 4, then obviously your armour thickness can vary even further. The old-style rotating turrets, They just have a single thickness all the way around, plus the roof, obviously on both types. One of the other big differences is how far do these things go? The old-style rotating turrets, they're literally armoured gun houses beyond the main deck, or whichever deck you happen to be mounting them on. Generally speaking, the armour doesn't go much further. It might go a little bit further down than the deck itself, but it's very rare. And usually, I say that's as far as the protection goes. Any protection below that is usually provided by the side armour of the ship in question, if indeed there is any, or perhaps an armoured deck in some of the later designs. Whereas with a modern fully armoured barbette, the, again, quote-unquote, turret is only part of the overall protection system. You also have this armoured barbette that goes a lot deeper into the ship in order to protect the shell handling rooms and such like, and the upper parts of the magazine, again, depending on design. Another issue is how they rotate, depending on if you're using a Coles turret or an Ericsson turret. Whilst some of them did involve wheels or roller bearings, in general, the old-style rotating turrets that look a bit like a circular biscuit tin use a central spindle of some description, whether that's the entirety of the rotational mechanism or whether, as I said before, it's on some kind of wheel or bearing system, but that is always there. Whereas most if not all of the more modern fully armoured barbettes tend to use motors and they have a roller bearing path, but there you won't find a central spindle in the middle. Instead, on a fully armoured barbette, that's generally where you'll find some form of hoist, whether it be for shells or charges. And lastly, usually because of the existence of that spindle, you will generally tend to find that the weight of a old-style turret's guns normally, not always, but normally is a lot closer to the centre of the turret for balance purposes, whereas in the fully armoured barbette style you'll tend to find that the guns are mounted actually quite far forward on the overall semicircle that constitutes the forward half of the gun turret, and that's because with this fully armoured barbette gun house on top, you can counterbalance that by extending the turret further back, putting in counterweights, etc. Because on a roller path, it's much easier to have an overall balance in that respect than it is with a central spindle of rotation. Again, there are exceptions more on the old-style gun turret side than there are on the fully armoured barbette side, but those are very rare and usually involve either a lot of complicated machinery and calculations to make sure it worked properly, or they flat out didn't work. The Cat with a Top Hat asks, were there any battleship or battleship designs which incorporated a secondary battery of guns larger than 6 inches? So it depends what you define by battleship. If you mean battleship as in any steam and steel vessel that was called a battleship, then yeah, plenty. Loads of pre-dreadnoughts actually had secondary batteries larger than 6 inches. The rather wonderful I'm going to put a turret literally on top of another turret design of a number of American pre-dreadnoughts is illustrated here. But yeah, so there were 7.5 inch, 8 inch, 9.2 inch, 10 inch and all sorts of other wonderful secondary battery sizes present in pre-dreadnought and semi-dreadnought battleship designs. But when you get to dreadnought designs, not so much. I mean, unless you want to get really technical and point out that the Japanese 6-inch gun, or what's commonly known as the 6-inch gun that was used on things like, say, Yamato, was in fact a 6.1-inch gun and therefore is technically larger than 6 inches, but that's just being nitpicky. And the reason for that is that back at the beginning of Dreadnought design, everything was reset. So Dreadnought had only 12-pounders intended to be used for anti-torpedo boat work back in an era when torpedoes were pretty small. But as torpedo boats and later destroyers grew larger and larger, that secondary battery, which was initially there purely to take out those vessels, grew to 4-inch and then 5-inch and 6-inch in various navies. And then when you look at sort of the Washington Treaty era designs, G3, N3, South Dakota, Lexington, N3, Tosa, and Amagi, all of those are 5-6-inch secondary batteries. Now, whether in the 1920s that might have expanded had battleship design been allowed to run amok is neither here nor there. I mean, I suspect it probably would have stayed around that size because taking out destroyers was still the primary purpose at that point of secondary batteries, and a 5 to 6-inch weapon for that period is still about the largest gun, that you're going to get fast firing. So that's a hypothetical, but I don't think it would have gone much above that. And then by the time you get to the other side of the battleship holiday, when people are constructing the treaty era battleships and such like, now they're looking still at destroyers, and destroyers have been capped, roughly speaking, at a given displacement that's similar to some of the bigger ones that were under consideration at the start of the treaty era, so there's no particular need for the secondary batteries in that consideration to go up in size. And then you've also got to deal a lot more with aircraft, so some ships, like say the Bismarcks and the Littorios, go for a heavier, sort of roughly 6-inch secondary battery with slightly lighter anti-aircraft guns, and others, such as the British and the Americans, go for the dual-purpose battery, and of course in that respect, again, fully elevated, fast-tracking, fast-firing 6-inch and above guns simply don't exist by the 1930s, and so they have to go with lighter weapons like the 5-inch 38 and the 5.25, or the 4.5 for that matter. So yeah, dreadnought battleships and battleship designs not really known for anything much above 6 inches. I mean, even Yamato in its original configuration is still only wielding the 6.1-inch triple turrets. Again, because of that whole, well, what are you going to shoot at? Light cruisers and destroyers, so therefore you need a relatively quick firing gun, and that's the quickest firing large gun that they can find. Gott Jaeger asks, if the totally real and not fictitious HMS Duke of Kent had been built, what would her life be? What effects would she have had on naval architecture? Well, here it is, ladies and gentlemen, HMS Duke of Kent. The 170 gun, yes, you did hear that right, 170 gun, 4-deck ship of the line, as supposedly designed by one Mr. Tucker in, if you can believe it, 1809. Now, as I said, there is some dispute as to whether or not this was actually designed in 1809, and I'm not going to get into that particular little kerfuffle here. But for the sake of argument, we'll take both sides and consider them briefly. If the ship was designed and built in 1809, bear in mind that's only 4 years after the Battle of Trafalgar, and if it was designed and potentially built around the time that its detractors claim it probably was designed, which would have been sort of the late 1830s, early 1840s. If the ship had been built in 1809, it would have, started construction in 1809, probably come into service around 1812, 1813-ish, which is rather an interesting date in and of itself. It would have caused a huge ruckus. It would have been a complete and utter step change. I mean, the Royal Navy at that point had mostly 100, 104 gun ships of the line. They were just about investing in the Caledonia class, which were a little bit bigger. But by and large, at least by rating, the Royal Navy's first rates were on paper outgunned by the average Spanish and French first rates, which, when you look at things like the L'Océan class, etc., they tend to be 110, 112, 120, and so forth gun vessels. Of course, you have the 140 odd something Santissima Trinidad, but that was an adaptation that didn't really work out too well. So, generally speaking, as I say, at least on paper, French and Spanish ships of the line of the period have a 10 to 20% gun number advantage over their Royal Navy counterparts. This thing comes along. This is effectively a third rate stacked on top of a first rate as far as firepower goes, which is just, yeah, it's a complete other level of things. assuming that the thing can get built without falling apart or without turning into something more resembling a barn with sails, which was the unfortunate fate of the Santissima Trinidad, everyone's going to have to react to it. I mean, forget USS Pennsylvania. If the Americans want to have their prestige ship of the line, they're going to have to go with something that more closely resembles a mobile wooden office block with guns than... Well, Pennsylvania actually did a fairly good imitation of that, but an even bigger one. And one of the things that causes some people to suspect its design may post-date its supposed design date by a fair bit is the fact that it also incorporates quite a lot of improvements in order to make its construction even possible, of the type that Seppings and Simmons put into place a few years down the line, ostensible to its 1809 date. So yeah, to build this in 1809, coming into service in 1812, 1813, well, it would have been hilarious to see this thing show up outside a port with the USS Constitution inside, to say the least. But yeah, it would be kind of like dropping an Iowa into the middle of the Anglo-German arms race in pre-World War One. Now, if we go forward in time to when it's the detractors of the 1809 date claim it was probably designed, which would be the late 1830s, early 1840s, it's still a massive step up compared to the current ships of the line, but maybe not quite as much. You've got ships like HMS Queen, HMS Duke of Windsor, HMS Duke of Wellington, etc. These ships are a lot bigger than the older ships of the line. There's 130, 140, give or take, going maybe a fractionally higher number of guns. Again, you've got things like Napoleon. So going to 170, it's still a big step up, but it's a step up in forms of it's an escalation rather than outside context problem. So this would be kind of the equivalent of maybe dropping a Queen Elizabeth class into the We Want 8 and We Won't Wait build program. So in that respect, yeah, people would probably start reacting to it. It would probably get delayed, as many capital ships of that period were. If it did get built in time, it would probably have been sent off to the Baltic to go and worry the Russians during the Crimean War. But to be perfectly honest, by the time everyone else was getting around to building replies to it, you would have started to see the beginning of the ironclad era. And so I suspect that any successors to it, and indeed possibly even the ship itself, would probably end up, like Royal Sovereign did, converted into the kind of semi-ironclad in the manner similar to, well, Gloire was built from the ground up as a wooden ship with ironclad plating, and as Royal Sovereign was in the Royal Navy, converted from a wooden vessel to an ironclad vessel, although still with a wooden frame. James Flynn asks, why did the British still use biplanes as torpedo bombers, such as the fairey Swordfish, at the beginning of World War II? The simple answer was practically everybody was. Now, when you say practically everybody, well, fair enough, there's only 3 major carrier fleets in the world, and the Japanese, the Royal Navy, and the US. But when you look at what the various navies had in service and what they had planned in 1939, the British actually during the 1930s had made the most of the running. They'd gone through 3 iterations of torpedo bomber already, including the Swordfish. And fair enough, there was a bit of a misstep there with the Albacore, but they had the Swordfish on deck in 1939 with the Barracuda, which, for better or worse, was a monoplane torpedo bomber, which would begin service the following year, at least in terms of its first flights. Its actual introduction into combat service would be a little bit thereafter. Now, in 1939, the Japanese were also using biplane torpedo bombers, specifically the B-4Y, and with the advantage of peace, they were able to introduce the B-5N shortly thereafter. The US, fair enough, was using a monoplane torpedo bomber, the Devastator, and To be honest, that was a massive advance. It was a world-beating aircraft at the time it was introduced. It's just a shame that aircraft were advancing so rapidly that a world-beating aircraft in the sort of the second third of the 1930s was something of a mobile target by the middle of World War II. Now, obviously, as military aviation history has pointed out in a couple of his videos, the Devastator does get a slightly unfair rap, considering at the battle where it got absolutely shot to bits, early model Avengers didn't really fare that much better. But regardless, the Swordfish as a torpedo bomber wasn't actually half bad, all things considered, when you compared the lineup of the B-4Y, the Swordfish, and the Devastator. It was certainly a competitive aircraft. And this mix of late-era biplanes and early-era monoplanes was pretty much standard for 1939. I mean, the Japanese were using the A5M, which was a monoplane but with fixed undercarriage as their primary naval fighter. The British were using the Skewer and the Rock, which were both retractable undercarriage monoplane fighters, and the US Navy was using the F2F, which was a retractable undercarriage but still a biplane. And of course its subvariant, the F3F. And when you look at dive bombers, well, the Americans were using the original flavour Helldiver, which was a biplane. The Japanese were using the D-1A, which was a biplane dive bomber, and the British were using, well, the Skewer, which moonlighted as a fighter, which was a monoplane dive bomber. So whilst the Swordfish can give an impression of perhaps fleet air arm obsolescence, the weird thing is that in 1939, the Swordfish is the only biplane component of the Royal Navy's carrier forces. The dive bomber and the fighter options are both monoplanes. You can argue about the effectiveness of the Skewer and the Rock, but they were still metal monoplanes with retractable undercarriages, whereas the Japanese had a fixed undercarriage monoplane fighter, but their torpedo and dive bomber elements were both biplanes, to be replaced in 1940 by the Val and the Kate. And on the American side of things, they had a monoplane torpedo bomber, but they still had a biplane fighter and a biplane dive bomber, obviously to be replaced with the Wildcat and the Dauntless by the time war broke out. And that's basically the main difference as to why the decks of Japanese and American carriers by the time they enter World War II are all kitted out with monoplanes. It's simply because they had another 2.5 years of relative peacetime to prepare and re-equip, whereas the Royal Navy was thrown in at the deep end, and that delayed the incoming of quite a number of different things, including a rather interesting gull-winged version of the Spitfire that was being developed for sea service. And George Carpellan asks, how comes calibre sizes have remained similar or the same throughout the years, such as 76mm, etc.? Essentially, it comes down to humans. Two factors. One, with the possible exception of the French, we tend to like whole numbers. It just makes us feel slightly better. I guess the internal OCD-ometer is present in most humans and just present in some more than others. So when it comes to developing the calibers of things, when you're not doing it by weight, people tend to like sort of 3-inch, 4-inch, 5-inch, 6-inch, etc. Although, as I say, again, there are exceptions with things like 4.5, 4.7, and then when you get into metric, what might be a nice number in metric might be sort of 6.1 or 9.4 or something like that in imperial. But the main factor, which is, again, it's still human-based, is weight. Up until basically mid to late World War II, every shell is going to have to involve some form of human handling, unless you're talking about the absolutely ridiculous-sized battleship shells. But on the smaller scale of sort of small to mid-caliber weaponry, something up to sort of 6 to 8-inch caliber, any projectile going way back into the era of the Age of Sail is going to have to be handled by people, and people have certain limits on their strength, and if you have multiple people handling a shell, there's still a relatively consistent multiplier to that strength. And since people don't vary too much when it comes to that kind of thing, it means that within certain tolerances, with obviously different weights and measure systems, especially in the pre-SI unit era, people tend to arrive at around about the same weight for this is comfortable to handle and this does X amount of damage. So this is why things like the 24-pounder cannon were fairly ubiquitous across the planet, because it's a useful weight. It can be handled by an individual, does a bunch of damage. Everyone kind of standardizes around roughly that kind of thing. And because, let's say, humans are still reloading guns in World War I, they're still reloading guns in World War II, it means that those kind of weight systems are still going to carry forward, and therefore, if the shot weight is going to stay roughly the same, it means the calibre is probably also going to stay roughly around the same. You can make sort of all sorts of fun mathematical arguments as to why you should go for this or that particular calibre or of weapon or weight of shot, and it's all well and good. You might have a very good point on paper, but when you look at most of the weapons that were developed along those lines of mathematically this adopts the ideal balance of weight versus rate of fire versus size of round, you tend to find it comes a cropper of the human factor, where especially when you're talking in shells and shot of around about a calibre of between 5 and 6 inches, because you enter this really uncomfortable zone of it being just too heavy for a single person to easily deal with in a seaway, in a moving ship. But if you're going to have to end up using 2 people, it's just too light to justify it. The sort of 6-inch becomes kind of the floor, the minimum of if you're going to use 2 people to handle a shell or a shot. That's kind of the smallest one that you'd really want to use to have make effective use of the fact you're having to double up on the loaders. Nickboy302 asks, Hearts of Oak versus Royal Australian Navy Quick March. Which one do you think is better? So, it depends what you mean by better. And yes, I know that sounds like trying to play both sides against the middle, but I do think I have a fairly legitimate point in this regard. And that is that, well, the Royal Australian Navy anthem is played at a quick march, so there's a relatively limited number of speeds you're going to hear it in. Hearts of Oak was originally designed for an opera piece, so there are a number of arrangements of it at varying play speeds. Now, as an anthem, I think Hearts of Oak is probably the better piece of music, but I say that because again, obviously this is all personal and subjective, but I think the best Hearts of Oak arrangements that I've listened to tend to be done mostly on strings, with a bit of horn in the background, and are done at a slightly slower tempo. And again, this is my personal preference, but I tend to find anthems that are a little bit slower have a bit more opportunity to feel a bit more grand. They tend to bring in the heavier instruments, if you like, and that makes them sound a lot more inspirational to me. Hearts of Oak, when it's played in faster beats, to me at least, it loses something. But at the same time, from the tempo that my favourite versions of Hearts of Oak are played at, you wouldn't want to be marching to that. You'd effectively be slow walking. Except for a few random quick sections, but never mind. Whereas the Royal Australian Navy anthem, set at a quick march, is actually a pretty good march. It's sort of how would I explain? The best way I could explain it would be that if you asked me to pick a piece of music to showcase the Navy, and I had these 2 choices, my recommendations, if I had to use the Royal Australian Navy anthem, the set at quick march, would be that you would use it as a march. You would have a parade of sailors, marines, that kind of thing. It would be set at that kind of speed, and that would look pretty good. Whereas if you were going to say, oh, you have to use Hearts of Oak, I would, as I said, use one of the slower tempos, and I would use that as a parade of ships, because everything runs a bit slower. If you put Hearts of Oak at a similar kind of speed setting to the Royal Australian Navy anthem, I think the Australian Navy anthem actually wins, because I don't think Hearts of Oak works at that speed. I haven't managed to find any versions of the Australian Navy anthem set to the kind of slower speeds that I prefer Hearts of Oak at. But but who knows, if someone does know of a slow burn version of it, maybe link me to it in the comments below and I'll have a look and see how that compares to my favoured arrangements of Hearts of Oak. Yes, I can be a little bit of musical snob occasionally. Mark Persad asks, was the Highball version of Barnes Wallis's bouncing bomb potentially an effective weapon against warships? And yes, it certainly had the potential to be, quite scarily in fact. So for those of you who don't know, this gigantic killer golf ball that's currently on the screen is a prototype of the Highball weapon. So Barnes Wallis's original bouncing bomb, as used famously against the Morna, Eder and Sorp dams, was a cylinder. A Highball was an anti-shipping version that, well, as the name suggests, was ball-shaped, and as the picture shows, was dimpled like a golf ball. It worked on roughly the same principle of skipping the bomb across the water and then hitting the ship. Now, in terms of how this was effective, there were a lot of things that would have made it a devastating weapon. One of the big problems with torpedo bombing was that it required you, at least until advances very late in the war with American torpedo bombers, it generally required you to go low and slow, and even if you were using the later modified versions of the Mark 13 aerial torpedo from Avengers, and you could drop it from somewhat higher and somewhat faster, you still had the problem that the torpedo itself only had a limited amount of speed. So if you dropped a bunch of torpedoes, it was entirely possible that even if your aim was completely perfect, the ship that was your target could evade them. Now, with Highball, you could come in, you had to still come in low, but you could come in at speed, which obviated one of the problems with most torpedo bombing runs. But secondly, this thing, because it skipped across the water at pretty much the speed that the release aircraft, minus a little bit obviously for drag and impact loss of energy, if you aimed this thing properly, there was practically nothing that the enemy ship could do to evade it, because they'd have a matter of seconds between bomb release and bomb impact. Now, why is this better than dive bombers, you ask? Well, for one thing, it's a lot easier to line up a perpendicular attack run than it is to line up a dive bombing run. And for second, this thing was at a scary amount of firepower. It weighed about 1,200–1,300 pounds, but half of that weight was explosive. So you're talking about a torpedo warhead's worth of explosive, except that when it arrived, it would either act like the old bouncing bomb did, in that it would hit the side of the ship, sink down, and detonate low down on the ship, so effectively have a mining effect with a huge amount of firepower on board. And of course, down below, that's where you want to introduce holes in the ship to let water in, whereas dive bombing, unless you get really lucky, tends to blow holes in the top of the ship, which can set fire to things, knock things out, set fires, but isn't as immediately fatal as blowing a 40-foot hole in the bottom of your target. Or secondly, as was demonstrated by tests on both the old French battleship Courbet and later the old battleship HMS Malaya, and I strongly encourage you to have a look on YouTube for the Highball bomb tests against those two ships, it could just punch straight into the side of the ship, at which point you now have 600 pounds of explosives scarily close to things that you really, really don't want 600 pounds of high detonating explosives next to, like magazines and engine rooms and you. So, yeah, especially given that the latter tests involved launching them in pairs from things like mosquitoes, these kind of things could have been utterly devastating. The only annoying thing from a historian's perspective is that they were initially planned for use against various Italian naval targets, and then the Italians gave up. Then they were planned against Tirpitz, and then Tirpitz got toolboyed, and then they were trucking them over to have a go at Japan, except one, the US Navy had already sent most of the Japanese Navy to the bottom, and two, by the time they'd got set up, operational, and ready to go there, Japan also had the temerity to surrender, largely because the Americans had erased two of their cities. So the poor old Highball pilots were sitting there going, literally everything we try and blow up gets blown up before we get there. Maybe it's some kind of curse. Maybe it's kind of, if you aim a Highball operation at a target, it's guaranteed to be destroyed by some other method, but just before they get there. But yes, absolutely terrifying weapon, in my opinion, for the immediate sort of mid to late World War II era. Pretty much the only problem with it was that, one, massive downsizing in navies after the war meant that its use against naval targets was obviously somewhat more limited, and two, the advances in rapid-fire radar-directed 3-inch and 5-inch and 6-inch anti-aircraft guns rendered even the high-speed, low-flying attack runs that would have been viable in the mid to late World War II period something of a suicidal hazard in sort of the late 40s, early 50s, and this led to the development of somewhat more standoff weapons. James Sean Moore asks, during the US Civil War, the Union employed a rather unique vessel, the US Revenue Cutter Naugack, I think, aka the A.E. Stevens, which is a lot easier to pronounce. The main gun was reloaded by depressing the muzzle below decks. This seemed to work for the vessel, as she suffered very few casualties and went on for another 23 years as a revenue cutter in New York Harbour. Yeah, I think aiming a 100-pounder Parrott rifle at smugglers probably has that effect. I think they took it off at some point, to be perfectly honest. Was this concept with muzzle-loading guns ever copied, or were breech-loading weapons developed so fast that it just overtook it? And the answer to that is no, a lot of navies actually did continue to develop and use this system for quite some time. As naval guns got bigger and bigger, it was pretty much the only way to reload the heavier weapons because, well, one, when you're involved in a fight that involves weapons of this calibre, being out on deck is not particularly conducive to long life and good health, but secondly, as the guns got larger and larger, shell weights got much, much bigger, and, well, manhandling them just became hilariously impractical, and so you needed some form of mechanical aid, usually a hydraulic ram. But if you're loading through the muzzle, well, again, you're not going to put a massive amount of delicate hydraulic machinery right in front of the gun, so it went below decks, and the below-deck muzzle-loading rifle was a thing. And this was the other thing, by the way. Once rifled weapons come in, you ain't loading a rifled weapon from the muzzle by hand. To be honest, you'd have enough problems doing that with well-fitted ammunition using a handgun, let alone a naval cannon. So, yeah, definite mechanical means needed, and hence the below-decks measures. Now, in the 1870s, breech-loading weapons at that scale did start to become a thing. There were initial breech loaders even in the 1860s, but it was the 1870s when this really took off. However, you saw the ultimate expression of this below-decks muzzle-loading equipment in the Royal Navy, because in the early era of adopting large-scale breech-loading guns, the Royal Navy had some issues with breeches failing, and looked at it and went, nah, don't like this, do not like this at all. Let's go back to the muzzle-loading rifles. They don't do that. And so for a while, the Royal Navy had some very, very large guns on some of its ships that had some very complicated and interesting loading arrangements that were pretty much development/outgrowths of the same principle that was used in this revenue cutter. Eventually, it turned out that there was one thing you could definitely do with a muzzle-loading rifle that you couldn't do with a breech loader, or at least very easily, and that was double load it, and then they managed to blow up one of their own guns, and that's when the Royal Navy eventually got with the programme and went off to investigate the possibility of actually using breech-loading rifles again. But yeah, so 1870s, 1880s, there was quite a lot of this system around in the Royal Navy, longer than most. Robert Henry Ilston asks, you talk frequently about merchant ships pressed into service as merchant escorts with weapons, and there were Q-ships, but were there cases of purpose-built warships that were disguised or designed as merchant ships? What was the pros and cons of such an approach? So it depends on the era. If you're talking about the age of sort of steam and steel, then no. For one thing, the rules of war tightened up a little bit at that point, but for second, the design criteria for warships in the age of steam and steel are such that their appearance, everything from mast superstructure, well, the massive gun turrets, and even the type of hull, all of those things, because design of hulls, specifically because of speed more than anything else, they're all so far different from merchant design at that point that pretending to be a merchant vessel is pretty much impossible. About the only thing you could do would be maybe on some of the cruisers you might be able to, with a massive amount of building up and of the superstructure, maybe pretend to be an ocean liner, but at that point you've basically crippled your main armament to such a degree that, well, you're either going to be blowing away all that hard-worn cover, or you're going to be sort of like, right, hang on a minute, give me a half an hour or so while I take down my cunning disguise so that I can fire at you, which is not really a viable option. Going back a little bit further, however, and it very much is an option. So you will have probably heard me mention in other videos about the squadron of East Indiamen that moonlighted as a squadron of ships of the line and scared away a rather large French frigate squadron, which by all rights should have absolutely destroyed that East India line and the couple of frigates that were escorting it. But it also did work in reverse. The reason the picture of USS Essex, the sail frigate, has been up here for a while is because this was one of her tactics when she was going after the British whalers. Because at that point, well, sails are sails, masts are masts. Aside from a certain amount of high-sidedness in some of the larger transports, and pretty much as that disguise of the East Indiaman showed, the main difference between a warship and a merchantman was usually that the warship was a lot smarter, a lot better handled, and it had a bunch of guns. But if you closed up the gun ports and you hadn't specifically painted the gun ports so that they were easily visible, then a ship with its gun ports closed up and a little bit more sloppily handled on the right flags could, at a distance, be very easily mistaken for a merchant vessel. And so this kind of disguise ourselves as a merchantman approach, especially for raiding ships, did crop up from time to time in the Age of Sail as a relatively effective tactic. There were still a few dicey issues around the rules of war, but as long as you ran up your own colours in advance of actually opening fire, you were generally on the right side of being called a pirate. So in that respect, there were mostly pros, just a few cons. The only cons obviously being you had to make sure you got your order of sequence right to reveal yourself, but also you did run the slight risk of, if you did look like a merchantman too well, then an enemy raiding vessel might come after you. And fair enough, you'd have a little bit of a drop on them, but if that vessel is a lot larger than you are, you have just attracted a lot of attention to yourself you'd rather not have. And to be honest, even if it's in a position where either you'll win or it could be a bit of a dicey engagement, as a raider, you want to be taking out enemy merchant ships. If your raiding career is cut short either through capture or because you're just damaged and need to go back and get repairs and new crew by encounters with an enemy warship, that might look good on your resume as, oh, I fought off this frigate or that frigate, but your objective was to destroy merchant shipping, which is what brings the enemy goods and money. And if you're not out there doing that because you only took on like 3 merchant ships before you ended up in the fight with this frigate, as opposed to if you'd avoided that engagement, you could have taken out 3 dozen. Actually, overall, you probably should have taken the 3 dozen and refused it. So that there were a couple of cons, but not a tremendous amount for the Age of Sail. And as I said, once you get into the Age of Steam and Steel, it's pretty much a hiding to nothing unless you're really, really dedicated to the cause. Matt Kidd asks, in the Age of Sail Royal Navy, what would the first rated ship a new captain might command be? Would it be more likely to be a ship of the line or a frigate? Given that an Age of Sail frigate was more likely to operate independently and ships of the line would be part of a squadron and thus under the supervision of more experienced officers. Was command of frigates given to more experienced officers even though they were smaller and less powerful ships? So this is where the types of frigates come into play quite a bit. So yeah, you definitely wouldn't give, generally speaking, a captain who was being given his first rated assignment a ship of the line. That would be far too dangerous in the vast majority of cases. Most captains would start out their well, captaincy. They might not actually be captains at that point. They might be a lieutenant or lieutenant commander in charge of a sloop or a brig or something like that, a non-rated vessel. But once they move over to the rated ships, they would usually be given command of a small frigate. And the reason for that is that you've got fifth rates and sixth rates, so we'd mostly be talking about a sixth rate. And that's because the ones that are operating completely independently tend to be the fifth rates, later things like the Razés, maybe the odd lower end fourth rate, that kind of stuff. Ships up to about 50 guns. The sixth rates, which are the ones that are armed with maybe a couple of dozen guns, relatively small weapons, etc., whilst they can operate independently, generally they would be assigned to frigate squadrons. So you see this actually with, say, Nelson's early career. When he's given the first frigate commands that he ends up with, he's part of an overall squadron, which in itself is part of an overall fleet, which means that the overall commander, whether that happens to be squadron commander or the fleet admiral in the area, can judge that person's ability. Obviously they'll be operating with the other ships, so they'll be sort of taken care of in that respect, and then they can be dispatched on their own missions at the discretion of the senior officer. And bear in mind that by the time you get command of any rated vessel, you will have already held probably at least one, maybe two or three command positions in non-rated vessels. So you're not a complete and total noob when it comes to being in charge of a ship. To be given command of even a frigate is a mark of significant trust by the Admiralty, and usually most of the incompetent officers have been weeded out by that point. But yeah, so frigates would be your first rated command, and this is why, depending on the career path of the exact admiral in question, you see this little bit of an odd bounce around, because you'll be given a small frigate at sixth rate initially, and then, depending on your expertise, and also to be perfectly honest, depending on what ships the Navy has available, you might then graduate to a heavier frigate, or you might graduate to a small ship of the line in certain circumstances. But then once your tour of that, whether it may be a 64 gunner or something, was up, you might end up back in a smaller vessel overall, but a heavy frigate, something like a 32, 36, 40, 50 gunner, something along those lines. Or you might just go logically up the progression of going fifth rate, sixth rate, sixth rate, fifth rate, third rate, and then maybe onwards from there. The introduction of Razés and the heavier frigates in response to things like the War of 1812 do kind of muddy the waters a bit further. So when you're talking about the upper ends of fifth rates and then the fourth rates and the small third rates, there is a little bit of a back and forth as to exactly what ship you end up in charge of in those areas. And also, in some cases, a command might just be a case of allowing you to get from point A to point B. So you look at Nelson, for example, is in charge of a number of capital ships of the line, albeit small ones, and then for a while he's in charge of the Minerva frigate, before he then gets back onto the ships of the line again. So, yeah, a little bit of a mess in that middle section, but anticipate commanding a sixth rate initially, unless you happen to have some very powerful patrons with a little bit of a questionable amount of judgment. And that brings us to the end of Drydock episode 104. Next week will, of course, be the Patreon Q&A livestream and Patreon Q&A Drydock, so hopefully look forward to that. And just before we go, a couple of minor bits of channel admin. The winners of the giveaway for the various milestones that the channel achieved should be announced in the next Drydock. Apologies for the slight delay there. And the reason for the delay to that announcement is, of course, the minor surgery that I had earlier this week. It may come as something of a shock to you, given that I am speaking to you now, that I did not, in fact, die. I succeeded once more in not quietly dying in the middle of the night, and so I'm still here with you, but the recovery from the general anaesthetic is taking a little bit longer, which is... well, it's delaying things, let's put it that way, but yeah, I'll be moving on with the selection process of the winners over the forthcoming week, all things going well. So with that said, thank you very much for listening, and hope to see you again in another video soon. Thanks very much.